to unlock the multiple benefits of tree canopy. I'm Belen Seara. I co-chair the Extreme Heat Task Force, and we are going to be having a great panel for you today. Next slide. So if you can write on the chat your name, organization, and your favorite tree, that will be great, so we get a sense of who is today in the audience. So your name, organization, and favorite tree. And to do that in the chat, it's at the bottom. And you can open it up and type your name, organization. So I'm gonna model here.
Well, people are doing it.
But I see it.
And do you want to go on to the next slide?
Good.
Right.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say a few housekeeping items. Everyone's microphones are going to be muted, but we do welcome you to keep your video on, because we'll have some discussion at the end. As Belen just talked about the chat function. During Q&A, you can use the raise hand function, and for phone, you can just use the *6 to unmute and thumbs up to raise your hand. And if you do have any questions, Rosa, her email address is there, and you can send her a private message. On the next slide, there's just a diagram of these things I just talked about. Especially, I think most people by now know about the unmute and chat generally, but the raise hand feature is under reactions there. So that's it.
Wonderful. So just briefly, the Extreme Heat Task Force is a collaboration between the Office of Sustainability and San Mateo County Health. Is part of the Climate Ready initiative that the Office of Sustainability is leading to address climate change hazards. It's a collaboration of government, academic institutions, and community leaders that started back in 2019. And then with the pandemic, we put everything on hold, but we are ready to start resuming the work plan. And we had a webinar in the fall of 2020 to kick off some conversations around extreme heat. And this is the second webinar of a series of webinars we are planning to have in the future. Next slide. So just to give you a sense of the issues raised by community leaders and members of the task force related to heat here in San Mateo County, is that the heated thresholds are inadequate. These thresholds are the ones used by the Office of Emergency Services and cities to kick off and activate protocols to open cooling centers. Then insulation in existing housing stock is insufficient. Most of our housing stock is old and has not been renovated. And indoor temperatures tend to get really high, even at 85 Fahrenheit degrees. Residents lack air conditioning, air filters, and insulating shades. It's estimated that around 36% or less of homes here in San Mateo County have an air conditioning. And we know that lower resource neighborhoods have low tree canopy, leading to higher heat in their neighborhoods, or the heat island effect. And there's a need for uniform heat safety message, especially it was during the pandemic and during the shelter in place, was important for the people to understand what to do, given that we had very limited options on where to go. Next slide. So with that, today we are here to start the conversation around a long-term strategy identified by the task force around increasing tree canopy. And we have three stellar presenters today, and they will be introducing themselves. So I'm going to pass this to our first speaker, Erika Spotsko.
Hello, everyone. Belen, can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me?
I can get, yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about the connection between sort of making the case for multi-benefit solutions using nature in cities, and the connection between extreme heat and human health and biodiversity benefits that can be also achieved through nature. So as you're thinking about moving from a grayer city on the left to a greener city on the right, there's of course biodiversity benefits that can come along with that. Greener cities can and do already support large amounts of biodiversity, including lots of species, native wildlife and native plants that you wouldn't necessarily expect. In some cases, that includes threatened species that are not common anywhere else outside the urban landscape, and a number of species that actually do better in cities than they may do outside of cities. So we know that the case for nature in cities to support biodiversity is strong, and that the urban ecology science that supports that case is growing every year. But we also know that that same nature, that the greener you make cities, the more that those greening actions can also support many different dimensions of human health. So I'm just going to talk about the connections between those things. In general, the sort of multi-benefit, the different types of benefits you can get from nature, human health, and other types of services as well. So next slide. So starting with the biodiversity perspective, we at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, I just realized I totally forgot to introduce myself. I work for the San Francisco Estuary Institute. We're a science-based nonprofit, and I lead scientist of a group called the Urban Nature Lab, which is thinking about how to incorporate nature and how to use science to support incorporating nature into cities. So about a year ago, we published a report summarizing the science on what types of biodiversity actions can be meaningful in cities to support support biodiversity specifically. And we took in that report a corridor patch matrix sort of framing of how to think about greening. So so you can sort of see what this looks like in this landscape on the left, where your corridors are your long greenways. It can be greenways or stream corridors. Your patches are your green spaces, so your sort of open spaces, your parks, etc. And the matrix is everything in between. And it turns out that all three of those types of spaces, if they are green and if they are sort of designed with if they have habitat included within them, are all good for biodiversity. And so what that means is that all three of these pieces together sort of form your landscape within your city. And if you can think about all three of them together, you're going to do better for biodiversity support than if you're thinking about only your parks in isolation for what's around them in the matrix, for example. So if you could go to the next slide. So what we found, so what this literature suggests is, again, that this integration across the different types of spaces is what's really important for getting the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak, for biodiversity. So this is a slide that's showing some data results from a recent work we've done with bird monitoring data taken from Mountain View and Sunnyvale, close to the Baylands. And what we found from that was that if you sites were nested within neighborhoods, so there were 1 hectare sites nested within neighborhoods of 500 meters around. And what we found was that there were the best possible, the maximum number of birds was found within sites that had both good site quality and good neighborhood quality. And if you had a good site but poor neighborhood around it in the matrix, you had fewer birds. And likewise, if you had a good neighborhood but a poor site within it, you also had fewer birds. And so this really speaks to the need to think about integrated actions that think not just about one piece of the landscape, but all of them together from a biodiversity perspective. That's really important, but we think that's also important for other human health benefits as well. Next slide. So to speak to the health for just a minute, what we've done and what we've started to do over the past year or so through some funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is to say, well, we know that patches, corridors, and the matrix is a nice way of thinking about the landscape from a biodiversity perspective, but do those same ideas translate into the human health context as well? Because we know that human health is strongly influenced by the presence of nature, and many different dimensions of human health are affected by nature, and this literature and science is also large and strong. So we looked specifically at those first three, and we found that using a literature search of about 260 scientific articles. And what we found is that there's both overlap and distinction. So on the one hand, there are things like social support and sense of community that appear to be well provided by corridors. But at the same time, there's also the Venn diagram of overlap in the middle, where depression, anxiety, stress, obesity, body mass index, physical activity, and heat exposure are all reduced by green space, no matter what form it comes in. So whether it's in the matrix or in a patch or in a corridor, that nature is providing those same benefits. Next slide. We've also done some work thinking about the multi-benefit elements, as sort of the other elements associated with nature. And this is some work we've done recently trying to estimate and capture the value of trees in a stormwater context. So we did this in Sunnyvale, and this is a report that was just published recently, a few months ago, by some of my colleagues. And what we found is that tree planting can reduce runoff, but actually the largest benefit from tree planting is actually from removing impervious cover. So depaving is a really important element of reducing runoff in a stormwater context. And we also captured the value of existing trees and found that the existing trees on the landscape are already providing between 3 and 7% of runoff reduction. Next slide. And finally, we know that these issues have an equity implications to them. I think this will probably be no surprise to any of our participants, but we looked specifically at equity related issues in tree canopy in Santa Clara County and found that both income and race were both drivers of, were both related to tree canopy cover. So higher income white neighborhoods tended to have more tree canopy cover. And again, this just confirms research that's been found elsewhere, but is very local in nature. Next slide. So in a minute, Maya is going to pick up in just a second talking about the East Palo Alto context. And we have some collaborative work we're doing there in the city of East Palo Alto. So I'm going to just show for a few seconds that sort of the difference between East Palo Alto and some of the surrounding landscapes with that equity lens in mind. So East Palo Alto has a higher impervious cover than the surrounding the cities that surround it. Next slide. East Palo Alto also has a dramatically lower tree canopy cover than the cities that it's directly next to, Palo Alto and Menlo Park being sort of the most notable examples of that. Next slide. And East Palo Alto also has sort of comparable, but arguably not great park area per person. And one thing to remember here is East Palo Alto has a slightly higher, a higher park area per person than you might expect, but a lot of that area is actually out in the baylands and not super accessible to people. So this is a little bit of an overestimate if you think about what people are really experiencing on the ground. Next slide. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that Maya and Canopy and SFEI are working together to think across the different themes that I've just been talking about: biodiversity, human health, connections to nature, and equity in the city of East Palo Alto through a collaborative project where we're creating an urban forest master plan for the city. So that's a place where we're trying to think through how do you plan for trees and how do you reduce sort of support human health and reduce urban heat islands through a kind of collaborative community process. So with that, I'm going to pass to Maya.
To me, actually.
Derek, sorry.
So my name is Derek Oyang. I'm affiliated with Stanford University, and I'm a lecturer there. I work with students on community engaged projects, and those have spanned a wide array of urban systems topics that we're all, I'm sure, interested in, but our focus here will be on some recent work on trees. I'm going to provide a little bit of a bridge here on synthesizing some of the big ideas and then passing it on to Maya, who will then return to specifically East Palo Alto and talk about some of Canopy's work there, some work that we've done in collaboration with Stanford, and then linking it all back to this exciting urban forest master plan. And then we'll do some discussion as a group afterwards, which I think we're all looking forward to. So let me try to frame that kind of multi-benefit vision that Erica started to explain as well, where, and I'm going to try to use mostly kind of public government language on this as well. Of course, there's a lot of individual costs and benefits as well. So I tend to worry that it's immediately the most apparent what the costs are with increased tree canopy from a public provisions perspective, because we're thinking about the books and thinking about how to sustain things like just the capital investment in the breaking up impervious pavement and adding trees. Of course, the long-term costs of maintaining the trimmings and what falls to the ground, et cetera. The water costs, especially if these are publicly supported trees, and then as they buckle, the concrete and sidewalk pavement. So I think this is all language we all maybe intuitively feel starts to bubble up as we think about, you know, the potential need to significantly increase tree canopy in many of the underserved areas that Erica's already pointed to. I tend to try to show the significant different imbalance once we begin to lay out a multi-benefit view in relation to what those real but then, you know, fixed costs are. Where first, you know, still speaking in the language of dollars, I think it's always important to recognize all the avoided costs that may come from a neighborhood and urban system that has greater tree canopy. Of course, this is harder to put on your books, which is partially why it's hard to compare these side by side, but that's potentially the role of academia to help make that case increasingly clear and just creative ways to work with administrative data. So examples would be avoided health care costs on the system from all those physical and mental well-being benefits, potentially avoided energy costs, both private and public, if those trees do good work to shade places where people inhabit. The benefits of carbon sequestration look like less other kinds of carbon mitigation techniques may have to be employed, or that it can be synergistic. And then, as Erica alluded to, some amount of potential runoff management so that there can be a justification for tree growth on an entirely different kind of bucket of public service needs like stormwater management. I also think there's like so many positive benefits, not just avoided costs to trees. And sometimes this can just be accrued at the individual level. And it just means all of us having a higher quality of life, a kind of just better opportunity to achieve when it comes to our growth from children to old age to career development. It can certainly look like just great economic activity, exciting places to be recreationally, commercially when trees are in the mix. And then that broader, maybe harder to directly quantify on public coffers, but the ecological and biodiversity benefits as well. And then I also want to just introduce at this point in the conversation, we can revisit it later on, but so much of this can be driven by notions of environmental justice as well, which is in short to say that all those potential costs, avoided costs and benefits, they can have disproportionate impacts across communities. And to the degree that our governments are attempting to reduce inequities that sometimes may have been caused by past public choices, then what better way to frame trees as also helping to close gaps? So not just all those general benefits, but benefits in exactly the places where they've been really underserved for our most important communities. I want to briefly touch on healthcare. This is because I personally have spent the last 12 months or so very focused on COVID response. One of my initiative's primary collaborations has been with Santa Clara County's Department of Public Health, helping to build out their contact tracing system and work with all that patient data to develop better interventions and support for vaccinations, et cetera. So for me, that was actually my first foray into the messy world of administrative health data. And part of doing that work and starting to do some of the tree work we'll talk about more is I just started to ask from a like wonky data perspective for all the other data people in the room, like what can we learn from hospital data that maybe we don't actually have communicated clearly enough about the avoided healthcare costs or just like what is the relationship between heat, canopy, et cetera, on hospitalizations and other kinds of healthcare costs, so that that can just be more concretely part of the conversation. Because I'm sure this is true for some of you guys, but my intuition is that that's a huge argument to make for trees, which right now we can maybe intuitively make, but don't have hard numbers, especially as are relevant to specific counties and specific decision-making bodies about how that links to tree canopy investment. So since like I said, I work with students. So actually just this past quarter, we started to dabble in this space. You'll see a little other student work in Maya's section, but just kind of hearing from our partners and community members about heat events anecdotally, but not just seeing the full amount of data, we started to ask, hey, how can we get access to some county health data? We didn't quite make that happen yet. I'll kind of end with that plea. But one thing we were able to do at Stanford is, there's just some high level intuitions around the geospatial analysis. We can look at canopy, cover some maps that Erica has already shown as well. You can look at impervious surfaces and just see spatial correlations between that and something like land surface temperature or ambient air temperature, et cetera. So starting to get to that correlation between some kind of urban typology and effects like urban heat island. But to really make that link to hospital data, short of having direct administrative data, one benefit of being at Stanford is you've got a lot of access to other kinds of researchable data sets. So there's a data aggregator that we were able to get some pretty in-depth and pretty robust healthcare data, which includes at the zip code level, tons of records anonymized in San Mateo County. The data is super complicated for anyone who's done this kind of analysis, but importantly, we were able to pull out two important things: zip code level identification of where people live. So then we can make the connection to, say, tree canopy and heat, et cetera. And then something called ICDs, which are these codes for those who work in healthcare for labeling diagnoses. There's hundreds of these, but we were able to focus on some ICD codes that relate to potential heat-related issues. Now, of course, these could be in conjunction with other kinds of issues, but say if you could just ask, like, where are these kinds of diagnoses occurring in time and in location, and then to what degree is heat and potentially canopy at different times throughout the years a predictor of these heat-related visits. And if we can build that evidence base, then that helps us be more grounded in our advocacy for investment in trees, partially being motivated by reduced healthcare costs on our system. Now, we're just starting to do this analysis. We're only a few weeks in, and it's suggesting already, even with some rough modeling we have to do here because of the sample size nature of the data, that there is this expected relationships. So, as we would all imagine, the higher temperature it was on that day, the more likely there was to have heat-related hospitalizations. The older the patient was, the more likely they were to have hospitalizations. The more tree canopy there was, the lower likelihood of hospitalization. And we're continuing to try to address confounding variables like income and et cetera. That's a big work in progress. But for me, one big concern is even just at the kind of ground truth level, I wonder if the data we're using at Stanford is not really telling the full picture. In part, I think the panel is only people who actually have health insurance. That's just the nature of how they get this data. So that's not the whole picture, right? Because maybe a lot of people who have heat-related visits are not on the books. And the county would have the best knowledge of that, not these kind of Medicare, Medicaid kind of data aggregators, right? The other worry is that this is just hospitalization data, but there can be a much broader sense of like people who just suffer from heat and that affects their day-to-day well-being, but they're not actually going all the way to the hospital yet. And so there's just much more to learn here. So I think this is just scratching the surface. And I'll just conclude before handing off to Maya to go back to the East Palo Alto case study. We can return to a kind of technical discussion as well, but I want to make a strong case for what I think is low-hanging fruit just through clever academic public-private partnerships. Here's an example of the kind of analysis that students were able to do in a few weeks with just one data set as a proxy from Stanford, but we were linking Earth imagery data from like Google Earth Engine to get heat historically since the early 2000s, canopy data like Erica mentioned, population data from the census, and then some hospital data. You do some statistical modeling, the kind of stuff we teach at Stanford and that many folks do. And what we're hoping to build is like a clear evidence base for like some amount of tree canopy appears to be associated with some decrease in hospitalizations through statistical analysis. Imagine if you had that kind of information with all kinds of understanding of the methodology at your fingertips for these conversations we're trying to have across the county and jurisdictions. So we're working towards that. But to me, a big ask I have is of the county and of other counties throughout the Bay Area is it possible to start to share certain kinds of hospital data directly with academic partners, with nonprofit partners? I know this is possible because I work with COVID patient data every single day. And I think it's just building the importance of this from just the urgent need from, say, a COVID response perspective to an equally important need to think about climate health impacts into the long term. So I'm really hopeful about that connection. That's part of the role that I think academic partners can play in this really rich collaboration. Now I'll hand it off to Maya to then talk about back at the East Palo Alto scale, what some of the nonprofit driven work looks like, and then how academic partners might be able to fit into that as well.
Thanks so much, Derek. Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Briones, and I work at Canopy, a local nonprofit in the Mid-Peninsula. We plant and care for trees for the benefit of all. And I want to talk a little bit about our long and strong relationship with the city of East Palo Alto. The city of East Palo Alto was fairly recently incorporated into cityhood in 1983. And just to set the scene for what East Palo Alto is like on the ground before and after Canopy partnered with them. It's the third most densely populated city in San Mateo County, right after North Fair Oaks. And it faces, it's at the crux of a lot of different forces and impacts, impacts of sea level rise, at the crux of climate issues and social inequities. And so as a small government, and sort of new government, it has limited resources, which also impacts its ability to plant and care for trees in the community. Next slide. So I just want to have this slide up just for a little bit because I think it's always a really striking comparison. Erica spoke a lot to this, but I just want to show you in map form how different East Palo Alto is on the ground compared to its neighboring cities. This gray to green gap is what we call it, where there's strong urban forests surrounding the city of East Palo Alto, but the city itself is mostly gray and concrete and that impervious surface. You can go to the next slide. And two important terms I think everyone here needs to understand when thinking about East Palo Alto are blockbusting and redlining. So real quick, blockbusting is essentially when real estate agents, as East Palo Alto was being developed, they used discriminatory tactics to scare white residents into selling their homes at a discount. And the fear base was being that Black families were moving into the area. Meanwhile, Black families from farther north in the Bay Area were moving down and were encouraged to move into these areas so that real estate agents can make a profit from the panic sales and selling at inflated prices. And then the other concept is called redlining, which I believe comes from the actual red markings on maps from in urban plans, designs. It's a discriminatory practice of denying services, typically financial, which include banking, insurance, healthcare, etc., to certain residents based on their race and ethnicity, due either directly or through selective pricing. And so these two things strongly impacted and shaped East Palo Alto to be where it is today. And the final thing I want to mention is that on this map, you see that 101 freeway pretty much sections off most of East Palo Alto. And so I think it's important for us all to know that what was there before was a growing downtown for East Palo Alto. So this impacted the community financially, obviously, but also it's a large source of air pollution that's directly impacting the community. You can go to the next slide. So now enter Canopy. Canopy started planting trees in East Palo Alto in 2006. Basically, a Canopy member met with a city of East Palo Alto council person named Patricia Foster, who saw that she wanted to specifically address the health and high level of asthma and hospitalizations, the health impacts in her community, and thought that trees might be a solution to that. And Canopy was a 10-year-old nonprofit, mostly in Palo Alto, and saw that really tree planting efforts needed to go towards communities with little resources. And so together, the small nonprofit, the Canopy was at the time, and the city council person worked together to create a program, which was the East Palo Alto Tree Initiative, and worked together to find funding, because funding is like the big thing, right? Like, we all know that this is important, but how do we do it? We need money to do it. And so together they were able to write a CAL FIRE grant. CAL FIRE funds various organizations to plant trees in communities labeled as DAC, or disadvantaged communities. And so these were the first few plantings that Canopy did. The freeway that I mentioned before was a huge problem and a huge problem site. And so that was one of the first ones to be tackled, and planted over 1,000 trees along that stretch. You can see the before and after pictures there. We also planted 14,000 trees across schools in East Palo Alto. And finally, in celebration of this new initiative, Dr. Wangari Maathai from Kenya, 2004 Nobel Peace Laureate, came and planted trees with Canopy in East Palo Alto to celebrate the new initiative. And that's actually Patricia Foster, the council member, with her in that photo. So we can go to the next slide. So I want to talk a bit about our model, because I think that's what's important, what it looks like on the ground to actually do this work. So finding funding was huge, because it enabled us to develop a strong model as a nonprofit with our own limited resources. So CAL FIRE funds us to this day. We've applied for multiple grants since then, and what we've been able to build into these grants is free tree and free tree planting. So our goal is to alleviate one of the major barriers to tree planting is the cost. So to alleviate that on residents, since we're servicing low-income communities, we wanted to take that barrier out. So the trees are free, and the labor is free. There's a free consultation with the tree specialist, someone on staff who will work through the appropriate species, check under and above ground utility conflicts. And then there's 3 years of free tree care, which is so important, because establishing a strong urban forest really requires a lot more front end work than maybe tail end work, is what we find. And then in addition, Canopy has been able to expand and create education courses and advocacy program, which focuses on partnerships, which I'm going to go into next. And so another barrier is maintenance. That's probably one of the biggest barriers, though there are many that I'll mention. This work isn't easy, but I want to make a case that there are tools and partnerships that allow us to move forward and get past some of those barriers. I'm not going to talk in too much depth about these tools, but I want people to know that they're out there and they're very helpful. One of them is Tree Plotter. It's a GIS mapping database that Canopy has subscribed to, and it's where we house all of our tree data, and we share it with the city of East Palo Alto. It's where we track health for inspections, to create maps and schedules in order to check up on our trees and to be successful in those 3 years of care. And it's also really integral for passing on the care afterwards. So the big question some of you may have is what happens after the 3 years of canopy care. So it depends whether it's a private or public tree. The private trees are responsibility of the homeowners, but Canopy works to create workshops and individual trainings with the homeowners so they understand what they need to do to care for their tree properly. And we have a lot of resources available. If it's a public tree, the city of East Palo Alto has agreed to take on tree care, which is huge because not all cities do. And the reason that's so important is because the city of East Palo Alto realized that they needed to have a foot in this, that this is their urban forest, that this is what generations have worked towards to have a healthier environment for their children and for youth, and to thrive and be sustainable into a future of climate change. And so it's not a perfect system, but I want to say that some jurisdictions, like I said, don't take care of their public trees. They use what's called maintenance agreements. And I just want to say that we have found that these are often unsuccessful because they end up having high tree mortality rates. Essentially, maintenance agreements, for example, in San Francisco, was that even if a tree was in the public right of way, it was the responsibility of the homeowner adjacent to that space to care for that tree. And so what they saw is a lot of trees being taken care of by different people who aren't tree experts, and all the trees are being taken care of differently, different watering, different pruning, different everything. And so in 2017, the city of San Francisco actually took back the responsibility of their public trees through the passing of Proposition E, which set aside some money for them to do that. The maintenance agreements create a lot of confusion, who was responsible for the trees. And like I said, it actually would be more expensive because it would save money long term by taking care of the trees with a baseline standard, rather than dealing with lawsuits and numerous amounts of removal needed when the trees died. So I want to make the case that the urban forest needs to be unified and not treated as individuals, because it's a whole biome, and the biome's not really functioning if there are all these patches of death and decay and stunted trees and all this stuff. And so that goes back to me speaking about young tree care, and that's why Canopy works so hard to take care of our trees. Next slide, please. And so I want to talk about one other tool, which Derek alluded to. So another partnership we've been able to develop is with Stanford, the Future Bay Initiative. Derek and I and his students were talking about some of the barriers to tree planting, especially in communities that we're less familiar with, but even in ones like EPA where we are familiar, sometimes we don't know where to start. And so together, Derek's team created what we call a tree planting prioritization tool, which is a individual parcel analysis. They each get an overall score based on a couple data inputs that we've put in, and can basically tell us where our priority places are for trees. And this tool, we created it, I think, last year, and started using it. And Derek's team has been able to replicate a similar tool for other jurisdictions in San Jose and Santa Clara County, because it is a really useful planning tool. So both of these tools that we have were developed and founded on the basis of partnership and collaboration. Otherwise, Canopy wouldn't be doing what we're doing without these conversations and these tools to aid us, because it's hard work. You can go to the next slide. And so this is all to say that I and everyone here, I think, knows that there are so many barriers to planting trees. I've listed a bunch here, and there are more. But I want to, really hammer down that there are ways to alleviate barriers. Nothing's really easy in this work, but equity work is not easy, and it takes time, but it's so important, because there are communities out there that don't get the benefits of trees. Trees are, they're a right, they're not a privilege. So again, our partnership with the city of East Palo Alto has been invaluable, specifically the urban forestry master plan that's happening now that Erica mentioned. That really wouldn't be happening without partnership. Canopy worked and put together the grant for another CAL FIRE grant to support the urban forestry master plan. We're doing the implementation of the plan while Erica's team is doing outreach and technical support. And then there's Hort Science as well. And that whole thing is happening because we're working together. And from preliminary surveys, it's in the process of the urban forestry master plan and the EPA context, is that it's very clear that trees are important to people and they want more, but there's a lack of faith and trust in local governments to do their part and take care of trees. And that's a barrier to getting them planted. So then we're back at step one, where we can't get things planted. So I feel like this is an opportunity for the County of San Mateo to provide strong leadership in a way that other jurisdictions don't. And it's just easier if we can work together and find solutions through collaboration. You can move to the next slide. And thank you so much. We'll be here for questions and starting the discussion. I'll pass it back to Derek.
Yeah, maybe I'll just quickly echo before we open it up, and Susan and Bilan can jump back in to help facilitate as well. But my sense is that there's probably less disagreement about everything we've discussed. There won't be contention on the arguments we've made, the data we've presented, so forth, about why trees are a good idea. It's much more just that there are these interaction costs and inertia across different bureaucratic and political processes that then mean that there's not as much investment or action on the ground on trees as we'd like there to be. Everything from just the kind of need for coordinated policy and programs at the county and city levels to Canopy as a nonprofit organization on a day-to-day basis, just having the practical data at their fingertips to do more evidence-based and targeted work. So I see it much more about barrier busting, and not that we have this like eternal disagreement on the value of trees. I'd love to maybe have that be a starting point and see if folks have reactions to that, as well as the other questions listed on the slide here about just, do you have experiences in your own jurisdictions on what that barrier busting has looked like or could look like, just so we can start to build some of those broader and more open conversations across everyone represented in this audience. Bilan, Susan, anything else to add before we open up?
No, I think that's, we have a few questions on the chat, so maybe we can start addressing those first.
Sure. I'll just note that Gloria had asked about, probably in reference to some of the data analysis I started to introduce, why just heat so far? Why not asthma? It's really just we're chapter one of, I think, a multi-part project we'll do, and can hopefully just lead to, like I said, data at the fingertips of decision makers and the public. And that's very much the kind of work we want to do, and get into air pollution, air quality related health impacts as well. Could be publications out of this work as well, and look forward to the opportunity for all kinds of partnerships on that. So I'll note that on asthma rates. Erica, Maya, others, and have you guys heard on Anne from Milbray's question on noise abatement? Any specific work on the impacts of trees on noise abatement?
I don't have like specific data points, but I can just say that was an with the sound wall planting part, first priority was pollution, but the second was noise. Absolutely, that neighborhood right there, was victimized by so much incredible noise from the freeway. And I don't have specifics on the reduction rate, but I do know that the trees have definitely reduced the noise impact of the freeway. So that's another solution that the trees can offer. Absolutely.
And Maya, do you want to briefly follow up on Anne's second question about just where you stand on the off-the-shelf software options we've been using, and then maybe some of the tools we've started to custom build together where we felt like there were some gaps?
Yeah, I'm looking for a question, so I can't quite find it, but so both the tools, Tree Plotter and the planning tool being very new, are extremely valuable. For example, being a nonprofit, I'm the only staff person dedicated to East Palo Alto, for example. And so for me to be able to do outreach, gather feedback from the community, get people interested in trees, and then do all the inspections on individual levels, it's a lot. And so the planning tool that Derek and I worked together were meant for two things, I think. The first one was that targeting how are we going to do outreach, because sometimes convincing people to say yes to trees is challenging, especially because there's so many other socioeconomic factors coming into these communities. And so being able to find, what specific block can I target then allows us to be more specific about the language we use. We can use that tool and show just the heat data, for example, and show individual level what this parcel looks like from a heat perspective. But we can also look at it from social vulnerability index. There's a lot of data points. I had taken out that slide for time, but and what's nice is that we can mold that tool, Derek and his team, to Canopy's needs, which is an amazing thing, and it's an amazing partnership to have that. And then our tree plotter was again molded to Canopy's needs when it was built. And they've been really great. I'm not sure what else I could add to that, but feel free to ask more specific questions.
And Maya, this is Belén. It works with private parcels as well as right of way, right? So
Yes.
it is a tool for local jurisdictions as well for private owners.
Yep, that's correct. And I know that I think Santa Clara County is starting to use both tools. And City of Palo Alto and East Palo Alto use tree plotter.
Yeah. See, Reed, you've got your hand up. Let's finish the kind of software discussion or say a little bit more about it. First, Erica, any sort of formal recommendations from the SFEI side on just what you think the software landscape is, if there's important gaps or things that best practices?
No, I think, thanks, Derek. I think Canopy is a much better place to know, specifically for tree inventory.
Okay.
I know a fair amount about other sources of tree data, but I don't think that's the question here.
Maybe I'll just conclude with two brief comments on the same question from Anne. So one is, I think there's a difference between like inventory level software, which tree plotter primarily is set up in that format, and then just like decision-making tools, which, you know, something like tree plotter will help drive decisions, but I think of just the much more complex realities of planning at the county level, jurisdictional level, operational level for a nonprofit. So we felt like we could jump in and fill some gaps we saw in terms of actual decision-making tools. But I'd actually strongly recommend that when it comes to inventory, this is where it helps to not have too many cooks in the kitchen. Because as soon as like every jurisdiction has their own solution for tree inventory, then you've got the problem of like those can't all come together. I'm pretty sure at this point that Santa Clara County is developing an urban forestry alliance where they've also gotten a subscription to tree plotter and are attempting to be the aggregator. I'm not aware, Belén or Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, if there's like a county level attempt to do that kind of tree inventory. This would of course be existing trees as well as planned tree projects. And I think that would be a helpful place where you do actually want to standardize and kind of all be on the same page.
Not that we am aware of. We have one more question here in the chat about the impact of tree canopy on magnetic fields. And then I have Reed from CCAG raising his hand, so we'll take him after. So anyone has from Linda, magnetic fields? I'm trying to catch up there.
Yeah, this is Linda. Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking. North Fair Oaks has a very large number of transmitters. And most of them actually are right next door to Atherton, but yet they don't put them in Atherton. They seek space in North Fair Oaks. And so my question is, I don't know, is there any correlation between the increase in electromagnetic fields and tree coverage? That's my question.
Sorry, Linda, not for me. Erica, Maya, yes.
I don't have any information on that at this time, but it is an interesting observation, and I'm curious to see what research can come out of that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Reed, do you want to go next, and we have Everett after that?
Sure. Yeah, thanks everybody for your presentations. Very interesting work. It definitely aligns with things that we're doing at CCAG, City County Association of Governments for San Mateo County, and on the countywide stormwater program. So, definitely interested in the benefits of trees with respect to managing stormwater, whether the canopy itself is intercepting rainfall or the potential to integrate trees with green stormwater infrastructure in projects on parcels or in road projects. And CCAG recently adopted a sustainable streets master plan for the whole county. So it includes all the cities in the county itself and the towns, and it prioritizes opportunities for green infrastructure integrated with transportation improvements of different types. So like intersection improvements, connectivity improvements with bike lanes, downtown kind of corridor improvements, and trees are a big focus of that. So I'll share the link to that if folks are interested, but I'm curious, have you all from any aspect of the team members here worked on specifically on the street side of things? It sounds like a lot of the work with Canopy is on private parcels, private properties, and working with residents. But you know, we've struggled a bit to have trees survive and do well in street conditions, and a lot of that has to do with the required, you know, the specifications for high infiltrating soils, high rate infiltration soils, and limited space in the right of way to do that. But I think there are ways to get creative, and especially if Canopy can help with either specifying species or helping trees kind of get established if they're new to a project, you know, that would be great. So I'm just kind of curious to hear if there's been any specific involvement in the street projects in particular. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question, Reed. A good amount of our trees are public trees, are street trees. A lot of residents in East Palo Alto, their properties are concrete. There's not a lot of plantable space necessarily on the parcel, but there are planting strips in some neighborhoods. And so the way we've worked on it is that we always check for utilities, and then the residents are required to do the watering still, but they are public trees, so they're not allowed to prune them or remove them, right, without permission from the city. Since we have an arboricultural knowledge base in our organization, we have specific species lists, mostly created by CAL FIRE, but because CAL FIRE, you know, says we can't plant thirsty trees, we have to plant trees that sequester a certain amount of carbon. That's the basis of the funding. And so we have certain species of trees that do pretty well, especially East Palo Alto soils are high salinity, clay, rough soils for certain trees. So we are familiar with appropriate trees for the appropriate space. And that's one of our mottos, is the right tree for the right place. You don't want to be putting an oak tree in a 2-foot planting strip, right? You want to be putting something smaller, and having, you know, different species and a more diverse tree species list approvable by whatever jurisdiction you're working in is really important, because each site's going to be a little bit different, and each tree has different root problems or issues, different branching, height, all these things. So I'd be happy to work with you on an individual basis to talk more specifically if you'd like. And I hope that helped answer some of your questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We
Erica.
have.
Yep.
Oh,
Just wondering if Erica, you wanted to weigh in. I have a couple comments on that as well, but especially I think Reed's point especially relates to matrix in that conception of the corridors, matrices and patches.
Yeah, just Reed, I just put a chat in here for you. If you'd like to connect on this a little more, we could do that. So we have a group that's doing hydrology modeling to specifically look at, like, we combine trees with green infrastructure features. How do you optimize that, and what benefits can it get? So that was the one slide I presented on trees and stormwater is from that work. I'm not a hydrology modeler, but I have colleagues who do that. We're working with the regional board on that topic specifically, and also with Matt Fabry, who's in San Mateo County, who you probably know from the green infrastructure work. And so we're following up on that work now to try to dig into, like, what are the design implications, and we have also done some work on street design. And I think one of the take-home messages for me is there are a lot of constraints, and the constraints may be too extreme if you can't also think about other re-envisioning of the street. Like, if you're constrained to just the 2 by 2 foot well, there's just a limit to what you can do. But if you can also get rid of a lane of parking and install bike lanes and, you know, do a kind of re-envisioning of the street, you have a lot more flexibility there. But anyway, I don't want to take too much time. If you'd like to connect on that, you should definitely reach out to me.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I have two quick comments and before we move to Ever on that. So the tree poll that Maya briefly showed, one of our factors is foot traffic. we use a certain kind of mobility data set to get a sense of where people are traveling to. So we are trying to prioritize parcels that are up against sidewalks that are heavily trafficked. So I think that gets into the transportation kind of notion. In Stockton, we started to develop use of a similar tool, and their public works department just shared with us their full inventory of maintained tree wells. So then we could do the tree score for tree wells that are like current tree stumps or empty, to help public works department prioritize where to plant new trees in public right of way. And I've not been aware of a data set like that at the county scale in San Mateo County, or individual jurisdictions who might have that and be willing to share, but that would be a great next step for the kind of tools we develop as well to do that in San Mateo County.
Wonderful. So we have 4 more minutes and we have 2 more questions. Ever?
Yeah, thank you. Quickly, one question, if anybody can answer it, that'd be great. There appears to be a disconnect between departments that manage health and those that manage infrastructure and environmental resources. And I wonder if there is an effort by county or cities to start that work of communication or collaboration to align critical current issues related to health and the environment, which in the past hasn't really been brought up.
So I can speak to that. This is the intent of the Climate Ready initiative, is to bring all these partners together. So we hope that this is just the beginning of the conversations around this issue, and we are hoping to, partnered with, we've been partnered with Derek on identifying the tools and the data sets that will be needed. So yes, absolutely, it is our intent to grow this collaborative work. And if you want to join us, as part of the task force, Susan and I, you can connect with us. Does that answer, Everett? Thank you. Uriel, we'll take your question last.
Great. Thank you very much. I was going to ask something actually very, very similar to what Everett just asked, but I'll do a follow-up specific to East Palo Alto. I'm sure other communities have similar issues. East Palo Alto, was for the most part developed prior to its incorporation as a city. So when the city did incorporate and inherited records, the records weren't necessarily complete for a lot of the underground infrastructure. Trees they're green infrastructure, they appreciate with value over time. But as a lot of the gray infrastructure and other infrastructure in the city sort of ages out and needs to be replaced, there aren't always necessarily accurate records where they can be, leading to some potential conflicts with trees as trees get bigger and the roots kind of expand through the underground realm. In particular, neighborhoods such as Kavanaugh, one that I'm thinking of, there's a sewer line that runs underneath a planting strip, which prevents street trees from being planted on an entire avenue of that neighborhood. So I'm just wondering if, on a county level, if there's any support that could be provided for mapping some of the existing infrastructure or helping with some of the long-term planning for replacing or upgrading that infrastructure, specifically to also make sure that there's room for trees, that both gray and green infrastructure is considered during these infrastructure upgrading processes. Thank you.
That's a good question, Ariel, and I don't have an answer for it, but I will take note. Susan, do you have information, or someone here, one of the in the audience?
I would suggest that the East Palo Alto City Council just put the request in directly to the Board of Supervisors.
And Uriel, your question was also related to an incorporated as well, or?
Well, that particular infrastructure was laid, prior to incorporation, when the city was, or when it was county land, and
Right.
I'm sure that similar issues arise in other unincorporated areas, or areas that had a similar development pattern.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we are on time. And we want to, Susan, do you want to close this out?
Sure. Yes, we just wanted to invite you all, if you wanted to join us for more of this discussion specifically on tree canopy. Please do reach out or send an email, especially that question that just was asked. If you want to put that into writing, we can see if we can get, further answers. But also if you wanted to participate in the Extreme Heat Task Force to keep this dialogue going, we invite you to do that. I think that would be the end for today. We'll make this recording available for those who registered.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists as well.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, everyone.